With chapter 38 of the Ickabog, Lord Spittleworth comes to call. Ma Grunter was one of the few cornucopians who'd grown richer and richer in the last few years. She'd crammed her hovel with children and babies until the place was at bursting point, then demanded gold from the two lords who now ruled the kingdom to enlarge her tumble-down house. These days the orphanage was a thriving business, which meant that Ma Grunter was able to dine on delicacies that only the richest could afford. Most of her gold paid for bottles of finest Jeroboam wine, and I'm sorry to say that when drunk, Ma Grunter was very cruel indeed. The children inside the orphanage sported many cuts and bruises because of Ma Grunter's drunken temper. Oh, well, that's awful. Some of her charges didn't last long on a diet of cabbage soup and cruelty. While endless hungry children poured in at the front door, a little cemetery at the back of the building became fuller and fuller. Ma Grunter didn't care. All the Johns and Janes of the orphanage were alike to her, their faces pale and pinched. And if you can hear that, that's Bruno having a little scratch. Bruni, stop it. Their faces pained and pinched. They're only worth the gold that she got for taking them in. But in the 7th year of Lord Spittleworth's rule over Cornucopia, when he received yet another request for gold from Ma Grunter's orphanage, the chief adviser decided to go and inspect the place before he gave the old woman more funds. Ma Grunter dressed up in her best black silk dress to greet his lordship, and was careful not to let him smell wine on her breath. "Poor little mites, ain't they, your lordship?" she asked him as he looked around at all the thin, pale children with his scented handkerchief held to his nostrils. Ma Grunter stooped down to pick up one tiny marshalander whose belly was swollen from hunger. "You see how much he needs your lordship's help." Yes, clearly," said Spittleworth, his handkerchief clamped to his face. He didn't like children, especially children as dirty as these, but he knew many cornucopians were stupidly fond of brats, so it was a bad idea to let too many of them die. "Very well, further funds are approved, Ma Grunter." As he turned to leave, the Lord noticed a pale girl standing beside the door, holding a baby in each arm. She wore patched overalls, which had been let out and lengthened. There was something about the girl that set her apart from the other children. Spittleworth even had the strange notice that he'd seen somebody like her before. Unlike the other brats, she didn't seem at all impressed by his sweeping chief advisor robes, nor of the jangling medals he'd awarded himself for being regimental colonel of the Ickabog Defence Brigade. "What's your name, girl?" Spittleworth asked, halting beside Daisy and lowering his scented handkerchief. "Jane, my lord. We're all called Jane here, you know," said Daisy, examining Spittleworth with cool, serious eyes. She'd remembered him from the palace courtyard where she'd once played, how he and Flappoon would scare the children into silence as they walked past scowling. "Why don't you curtsy? I am the chief adviser, the king's chief adviser." "A chief adviser isn't a king," said the girl. "What's that she's saying?" croaked Ma Grunter, hobbling over to see that Daisy wasn't making trouble. Of all the children in her orphanage, Daisy Dovedale was the one Ma Grunter liked the least. The girl's spirit had never quite been broken, although Ma Grunter had tried her hardest to do it. "What are you saying, ugly Jane?" she asked. Daisy wasn't ugly in the slightest, but this name was one of the ways Ma Grunter tried to break her spirit. "She's explaining why she doesn't curtsy to me," said Spittleworth, still staring into Daisy's dark eyes and wondering where he'd seen them before. In fact, he'd seen them in the face of the carpenter he visited regularly in the dungeon, but as Mr. Dovedale was now quite insane, with long white hair and a beard, and this girl looked intelligent and calm, Spittleworth didn't make the connection between them. "Ugly Jane's always been impertinent," said Ma Grunter, inwardly vowing to punish Daisy as soon as Lord Spittleworth had gone. "One of these days I'll turn her out, my lord, and then she can see how she likes begging on the streets instead of sheltering under my roof and eating my food." "How I'd miss cabbage soup," said Daisy in a cold, hard voice. "Do you know that's what we eat here, my lord? Cabbage soup 3 times a day." "Very nourishing, I'm sure," said Lord Spittleworth. "Though sometimes, as a special treat," said Daisy, "we get orphanage cakes. Do you know what those are, my lord?" "No," said Spittleworth against his will. There was something about this girl. What was it? "They're made of spoiled ingredients," said Daisy, and her dark eyes boring into his. Bad eggs, mouldy flour, scraps of things that have been left in the cupboard too long. People haven't got any other food to spare for us. They mix up the things they don't want and leave them on the front steps. Sometimes the orphanage cakes make the children sick, but they eat them anyway because they're so hungry. Spittleworth wasn't really listening to Daisy's words, but to her accent. Though she'd now spent so long in Jeroboam, her voice still carried traces of Shoeville. "Where do you come from, girl?" he asked. The other children had fallen silent now, all of them watching the Lord talking to Daisy. Though Ma Grunter hated her, Daisy was a great favourite among the younger children because she protected them from Ma Grunter and Basher John, and she never stole their dry crusts, unlike some of the other big children. She'd also been known to sneak them bread and cheese from Ma Grunter's private stores, although that was risky business and had sometimes led to Daisy being beaten by Basher John. "I come from Cornucopia, my lord," said Daisy. "You might have heard of it. It's a country that used to exist, where nobody was ever poor or hungry." "That's enough," snarled Lord Spittleworth, and turning to Ma Grunter, he said, "I agree with you, madam. This child seems ungrateful for your kindness. Perhaps you ought to be left to fend for herself out in the world." With that, Lord Spittleworth swept out of the orphanage, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he'd gone, Ma Grunter swung her cane at Daisy, but long practice enabled Daisy to duck out of harm's way. The old woman shuffled away, swishing her cane before her, making all the little ones scatter, then slammed the door of her comfortable parlour behind her. The children heard the popping of a cork. Later, after they climbed into their neighbouring beds that night, Martha suddenly turned to Daisy. "You know, Daisy, it isn't true what you said to the chief adviser." "Which bit, Martha?" whispered Daisy. "It isn't true that everyone was well fed and happy in the old days. My family never had enough in the marshlands." "I'm sorry," said Daisy quietly. "I forgot." "Of course," sighed the sleepy Martha. "The Ickabog kept stealing our sheep." Daisy wriggled deeper under the thin blanket, trying to keep warm. In all their time together, she'd never managed to convince Martha that the Ickabog wasn't real. Tonight, though, Daisy wished that she too believed in a monster in the marsh, rather than in the human wickedness she'd seen staring out of Lord Spittleworth's eyes. Let's have a look at the next chapter. Chapter 39. Burt and the Ickabog Defence Brigade. We now return to Shoeville, where some important things were about to happen. I'm sure you remember the day of Major Beamish's funeral, when little Burt returned home, smashed apart his Ickabog toy with a poker, and vowed that when he grew up, he'd hunt down the Ickabog and take revenge upon the monster that killed his father. Well, Burt was about to turn 15. This might not seem very old to you, but in those days it was big enough to become a soldier. And Burt had heard the brigade was expanding. So one Monday morning, without telling his mother what he was planning, Burt set off from their little cottage at the usual time, but instead of going to school, he stuffed his schoolbooks into the garden hedge, where he could retrieve them later, then headed for the palace, where he intended to apply to join the brigade. Under his shirt, for luck, he wore the silver medals his father had won for outstanding bravery against the Ickabog. Burt hadn't gone far when he saw a small commotion ahead of him in the road. A small crowd was clustered around a mail coach. As he was far too busy trying to think of good answers to the questions Major Roach was sure to ask him, Burt walked past the mail coach without paying much attention. What Burt didn't realise was that the arrival of that mail coach was going to have some very important consequences which would send him on a dangerous adventure. Let's allow Burt to walk on without us for a moment or two, so I can tell you about the coach. Ever since Lady Islander had informed King Fred that Cornucopia was unhappy about the Ickabog tax, Spittleworth and Faploon had taken steps to make sure he never heard news from outside the capital again. And here we have a little break. Styx has decided to join us to look at the fish. How are you? You are not a very helpful reading companion. There we go. Catch up. As Shoeville remained now quite rich and bustling, the king, who never left the capital anymore, assumed the rest of the country must be the same. In fact, the other Cornucopian cities were all full of beggars and boarded up shops, because the two lords and Roach had stolen so much gold from the people to ensure the king never got wind of this. Lord Spittleworth, who read all the king's mail in any case, had hired gangs of highwaymen lately to stop any letters entering Shoeville. The only people who knew this were Major Roach, because he'd hired the highwaymen, and Cankerby, the footman, who'd been lurking outside the guard's room when the plan was hatched. Spittleworth's plan had worked well so far, but today, just before dawn, some of the highwaymen had bungled the job. They'd ambushed the coach as usual, dragging the poor driver from his seat, but they couldn't steal the mail sacks. The frightened horses had bolted. When the highwaymen fired their guns after the horses, they merely galloped all the faster, so that the mail coach soon entered Shoeville, where it careered through the streets, finally coming to rest in the city within the city. There a blacksmith succeeded in seizing the reins and bringing the horses to a halt. Soon the servants of the king were tearing open long-awaited letters from their families in the north. We'll find out more about those letters later, because it's now time to rejoin Burt, who just reached the palace gates. "Please," said Burt to the guard, "I want to join the Ickabog Defence Brigade." The guard took Burt's name and told him to wait in the carrier. Then carried the message to Major Roach. However, when he reached the door of the guard's room, the soldier paused, because he could hear shouting. He knocked, and the voices fell silent at once. "Enter!" barked Roach. The guard opened and found himself face to face with 3 men. Major Roach, who looked extremely angry, Lord Flappoon, whose face was scarlet above his striped silk dressing gown, and Cankaby, the footman, who, with his usual good timing, had been walking to work when the mail coach came galloping into town, and had hastened to tell Flappoon that the letters had managed to make their way past the highwaymen. On hearing this news, Flappoon had stormed downstairs from his bedroom into the guard's room to blame Roach for the highwaymen's failure, and a shouting match erupted. Neither man wanted to be blamed by Spittleworth when he returned from his inspection of Mar Grunters and heard what had happened. "Major," said the soldier, saluting both men, "there's a boy at the gate, sir, name of Burt Beamish, wants to know if he can join the Ickabog Defence Brigade." "Tell him to go away," barked Flappoon. "We're busy." "Do not tell the Beamish boy to go away," snapped Roach. "Bring him to me immediately. Cankaby, leave us." "I was hoping," began Cankaby in his weaselly way, "that you gentlemen might want to reward me for—" "Any idiot can see a mail coach speed past them," said Flappoon. "If you wanted a reward, you should have hopped on board and driven it straight back out of the city again." So the disappointed footman slunk out, and the guard went to fetch Burt. "What are you bothering with this boy for?" Flappoon demanded of Roach once they were alone. "We have to solve the problem of the mail." "He isn't just any boy," said Roach. "He's the son of the national hero. You must remember Major Beamish, my lord. You shot him." All right. There's no need to go on about it," said Flappoon irritably. "We've all made a tidy bit of gold out of it, haven't we? What do you suppose his son wants? Compensation?" But before Major Roach could answer, in walked Burt, looking nervous and eager. "Good morning, Beamish." "Good morning, Beamish," said Major Roach, who'd known Burt for a long time because of his friendship with Roderick. "What can I do for you?" "Please, Major," said Burt. "Please, I want to join the Ickabog Defence Brigade. I heard you're needing more men." "Ah," said Major Roach. "I see. And what makes you want to do that?" "I want to kill the monster that killed my father," said Burt. There was a short silence in which Major Roach wished he was as good as Lord Spittleworth at thinking up lies and excuses. He glanced towards Sir Lord Flappoon for help, but none came, and although Roach could tell that Flappoon too had spotted the danger, the last thing the Ickabog Defence Brigade needed was somebody who actually wanted to find an Ickabog. "There are tests," said Roach, playing for time. "We don't let just anybody join. Can you ride?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Burt truthfully. "I taught myself." "Can you use a sword?" "I'm sure I could pick it up fast enough," said Burt. "Can you shoot?" "Yes, sir, I can hit a bottle from the end of the paddock." Said Roach. "Yes, but the problem is, Beamish, you see, the problem is you might be too—" "Foolish," said Flappoon cruelly. He really wanted this boy gone so that he and Roach could think of a solution to his problem of the mail coach. Bert's face flooded with colour. What? "Your schoolmistress told me," lied Flappoon. He'd never spoken to the schoolmistress in his life. "She says you're a bit of a dunce. Nothing that should hold you back in any line of work other than soldiering, but dangerous to have a dunce on the battlefield." My marks were all right," said poor Burt, trying to stop his voice from shaking. "Miss Monk never told me she thinks I'm a—" "Of course she hasn't told you," said Flappoon. "Only a fool would think a nice woman like that would tell a fool he's a fool. Learn to make pastries like your mother, boy, and forget about the Ickabog. That's my advice." Burt was horribly afraid his eyes had filled with tears. Scowling in his effort to keep from crying, he said, I'd welcome the chance to prove I'm not a fool, Major." Roach wouldn't have put matters as rudely as Flappoon, but after all, the impending thing was to stop the boy joining the brigade. So Roach said, "Sorry, Beamish, but I don't think you're cut out for soldiering. However, as Lord Flapoon suggests..." "Thank you for your time, Major," said Burt in a rush. "I'm sorry to have troubled you." And with a low bow, he left the guard's room. Once outside, Burt broke into a run. He felt very small and humiliated. The last thing he wanted to do was to return to school, not after hearing what his teacher really thought of him. So assuming that his mother would have left for work in the palace kitchens, he ran all the way home, barely noticing the knots of people now standing on the street corners talking about the letters in their hands. When Burt entered the house, he found Mrs. Beamish was still standing in the kitchen, staring at a letter of her own. "Burt," she said, startled by the sudden appearance of her son, "what are you doing home?" "Toothache," Burt invented on the spot. "Oh, you poor thing, Burt. We've had a letter from Cousin Harold," said Mrs. Beamish, holding it up. "He says he's worried he's going to lose his tavern, that marvellous inn he built up from nothing. He's just written to ask me whether I might be able to get him a job working for the king. I don't understand what can have happened. Harold says he and the family are actually going hungry." "It'll be the Ickabog, won't it?" said Burt. "Jeroboam's the nearest city to the marshlands. People have probably stopped visiting taverns at night in case they meet the monster on the way." "Yes," said Mrs. Beamish, looking troubled. "Yes, maybe that's why." "Gracious me, I'm late for work." Setting Cousin Harold's letter down on the table, she said, "Put some oil of cloves on that tooth, love." And giving her son a quick kiss, she hurried out the door. Once his mother had gone, Burt went and flung himself face down on his bed and sobbed with rage and disappointment. Meanwhile, anxiety and anger were spreading through the streets of Shoeville, the capital. Shoeville had at last found out that their relatives in the north were so poor that they were starving and homeless. When Lord Spittleworth returned to the city that night, he found serious trouble brewing. Oh, okay, so head over to Purple Mash and have a go at today's activity, and we will find out what happens tomorrow, and whether or not, well, what happens with Lord Spittleworth when he gets back to the city.